ladies and gentlemen. Our next title of the presentation, Blockchain 101. As you all know, blockchain has become the most talked about thing going on inside the payment arena, certainly in the last 6 months. And because it's such a big subject, we don't have one presenter on it for you, we actually have two. And they're both highly skilled and highly qualified to give us presentations on Blockchain 101. Let me introduce both of them to you. First and foremost, Mary Ann Francis from Wipro, who is a legacy banker and trusted advisor across financial services, treasury payments, and indeed blockchain itself. Mary Ann was responsible for the global trade and treasury practice of the 8th largest bank in America, and is currently an internal and external advisor for Wipro Limited, who are a global consulting IT and managed services powerhouse, as I'm sure you're aware. She sits on a number of advisory boards. She's also a member of the leadership committee of the Payments Innovation Alliance, and is a respected speaker around the world on treasury and payments related topics, and especially blockchain. So, joining Mary Ann on stage, Iqbal Ali Khan is here with us as well from IBM Corporation. He's the Strategy and Business Development Executive for the global payment industry and blockchains at IBM, with over 2 decades of banking experience across global commercial banks and services companies. And he's conducted both strategy and operational projects at commercial banks and global card companies across North America, Europe, and Asia. They're going to be presenting in a double header. There will also both be a part of the panel that will be talking about blockchain, taking your questions, ladies and gentlemen, as they finish up their first 45-minute presentation, and then we'll ask a couple of additional panel members to come up and join us. And we will take questions from the floor on everything you ever needed to know, and perhaps some things you didn't know you needed to know about Blockchain 101. Would you please welcome to the stage Mary Ann Francis and Iqbal Ali Khan. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Really lovely to be here. First, I have to address what apparently is an extremely important personal issue. I truly, really, actually am not cold. Thank you all for your concern, your jackets, your sweaters, you're rubbing my arms. I'm really fine. Thank you very much. What we're going to do is kind of tag team today. This really is a 101. It is not a technical discussion. It is a, what is the blockchain, what can it do, how will it do it? So we're going to kind of tag team on it. We will have to talk about Bitcoin for a minute, but we only want to talk about it for maybe 3 minutes. It really is about the underpinning technology called blockchain. So we'll address Bitcoin because we have to, but at the same time, that's really not what the conversation's about. I've heard Bitcoin mentioned many times already this morning. We're going to try and do this in 45 minutes, and we'll be around for later. It's not the simplest subject, but we're going to try and simplify it as much as we can. Bitcoin really kind of hit the screen in 2013. I think you've heard that mentioned a couple of times. I had the privilege, I think, of speaking at the first annual Bitcoin conference in San Jose, California in 2013. This was the exact week of Mt. Gox and Silk Road and the FinCEN decision, all in the same week. And I assure you it was a Star Trek convention. The folks that showed up were the Winklevoss twins. This is when Bitcoin was known for its anonymity. Everybody wanted to try and avoid the banking system. There was folks that came down from the mountain where they were hiding and living because they didn't want to pay taxes or capital gains. They wanted to use the network for all the wrong reasons. There was also millions of venture capitalists because this is when the checks were flowing. The first Bitcoin ATM happened to make an appearance there. And the reason for that sort of genesis is that over the last 3 years, it's really changed and evolved. The Bitcoin doesn't have quite the negative tone to it that it used to have. We all know as payments people, anything can go wrong in any payment system. I've had a lot of arguments at a lot of different conferences on who owns the blockchain? Well, who owns the internet, right? You don't always have to have a specific owner. You need to know what you're doing and how you're working on it. And I've said millions of times, and I'll say it in the summary, in 1995, we had this thing called the internet. And we all remember, probably most of us remember, trying to explain the internet to the corner office in 1995. right? Oh, no, by the way, in 20 years, we're going to be moving money. We're going to be doing it on our phones. We're going to be checking it, right? So we don't know yet everything that the blockchain can do, but we really do want to avoid the conversation of the currency, its valuation, how many bitcoins does somebody make. I know we asked a question this morning, somebody asked a question on how many people owned a Bitcoin. Anybody own a Bitcoin that you'll admit to? Okay, we have a couple hands, that's more than this morning. Most importantly, as we talk about the blockchain itself, I'd like to ask how many people think the blockchain should be regulated? Are you afraid to answer, or you really don't think it should be? Okay. Oh, we have a couple hands over here, all right. Most people, usually the audience is like 90% it should be regulated. So I'm going to talk about the Bitcoin for a second, unless you want to add anything more about the history, Iqbal, of kind of how we got here.
The only thing I'd like to say
it.
is, well, actually, I'm not here just to click for.
Yeah, he's not just my driver.
But so for IBM, we looked at the technology about 2 years ago, and I was introduced to this 2 years ago, and I thought, this is going to take a long time to really play, so I didn't spend any time on it. Since September of last year, we've had just so much of a flow of interest on this. It's phenomenal. Bitcoins is not something that IBM is at all involved in. We're only interested in the technology behind it.
Right, and I think that's really the important message we want to kind of go from here, because it's a cryptocurrency that was invented in 2008, kind of launched in 2009 by this mysterious man that some people say has been discovered in Australia, other people doubt. But it was really made for peer-to-peer, real-time, and outside the banking system payments. And when I made my presentation in San Jose, the title they gave me was, "How is Bitcoin going to change the payment system?" And when I went into this room where I thought there'd be 30 people, there was 300 people, and regulators and mountain men. And I said, I'm going to change the title they gave me to "How the Payment System's going to Change Bitcoin," because y'all aren't playing together. Nobody was talking to each other. They were, anonymity was the big deal. And thus became all those arguments, right? And then there was a couple losses or thefts or whatever anybody wants to call it. And that really had nothing to do with necessarily fraud. It had to do with not understanding the technology, that you need, a key, and you have to hang on to that key. And if you all drop your debit card in the hall tomorrow with your 4-digit code on the back, someone's going to drain your bank account. So just like that, you have to manage your keys and keep it to yourself.
And also the contracts. So not a clear understanding on what the contracts. So I think the one that you were referring to, there was a smart contract that drove that particular transaction.
Yep.
And people did not understand what the elements of the smart contract were, what the terms and conditions.
Yeah, very much. And so the key becomes, this is where the separation goes now, right? So the currency stays over here, and we're not going to talk about it. We have a couple of examples. We're actually not going to use all the slides. There are more in there for your content when you get them. But we want to move over to the technology. So the Bitcoin was written on an open source blockchain, and open source has been around since the 60s. It started as shared software, if anybody remembers those terms, and has evolved into what is now known as open source. It's so huge, most of you work with it in some capacity. We actually have a 10,000 person practice doing it. But the guy that invented it, whoever this was, and wrote the paper, it actually was published on Halloween. I don't know if that was calculated or not, but the whole point was to create a currency that could be peer-to-peer, outside the banking system, real-time, and use a blockchain-like technology using open source. So that's why the Bitcoin was established on an established set of rules that already had been in place for a long time. Chaining started more in the 90s, but the open source, without that name, actually started in the 60s. You can skip that one, actually. That's one for you. So the digital ledger, the consensus ledger, the virtual ledger is really the language that we should be talking about, right? This is where the purpose of having the blockchain and what it can do goes back to thousands and thousands of years. And this is a silly stone that was in the village of Yap thousands of years ago. And the way that they transact their transactions was there was this stone, and it never moved. Or it could, if they had smaller stones, it could. And on this stone, it said Marianne owned this asset, and she bought it from Iqbal. And so on one side of the stone was that, the other side of the stone was the buyer, and it was written in stone, and it was virtual, it was digital, it was consensus, it was public, right? Just couldn't move it. But when you think of each side of the transaction, it was there. And everybody in the village could see who owned the goat, who owned the house, who bought what from whom, because it was carved in the stone and it was assets and liabilities on each side. That's what a digital ledger is. We've just made it electronic, right? So when they even tell stories, because it's real. They tell stories of if somebody had a stone that they were delivering to somebody on another island and the stone fell out into the lake, everybody was cool, because everybody knew the stone that said Iqbal owned it was in the lake. So everybody was cool. That was the trust that took place with it. So when you move to the next ledger, everybody's seen these old-fashioned ledgers, right? On this side, you bought this guy sold this. It's open, it's virtual, it's transparent, it's public. That's very much how you have to think of how these ledgers work. It's simply in a cryptography, right? There's a lot of cryptography that goes in it, there's algorithms, but underneath it is this side, and it can't be changed. It's visible, it can't be undone, unless the two parties agree to undo it, right? So you have reconciliation, you have transparency, you have visibility, you have security. I'm going with this ledger versus today's, where we have the security that goes with the crypto security.
The only thing I would add on this is that currently the way it works is every business has its own ledger. And I'm running a business, I have my ledger, Marianne is a supplier to me, she has her own ledger. Now what's happening in a lot of developing countries is that I have 3 ledgers, Marianne has maybe 4. And it's for different people and different purposes. We'll build on that as we go.
You can skip that one. That's just a typical before and after Bitcoin transaction. So this is the most technological slide that we will have. But it simply talks about so chaining is the name of what started back in the 70s and 80s in order to build on these transactions, right? So it's called a blockchain because each transaction is blocked and chained. So whatever you do here is irrefutable. It's agreed to by all parties. In order to get in there, it's irrefutable. It's agreed to by all parties. It's locked in, end to end, and whoever does the next transaction is chained to that. And as you continue to build these blocks, that's how you get the blockchain. When you think of what you can do with that kind of technology, now you can think of all the contracts that you have in place, all the paperwork that goes with them, the tracking of a money transaction, cross-border or domestic. So the idea behind the technology is to put everything in one place, so everybody who's agreed to and in it can see it, can't go back and change it without agreement, right? Those are usually contractual. It never changes. It happened. If you do something down here that changes it, that's fine, but the first transaction and the last transaction is what shows. So that's how you have to think about how the data flows. It's really just a huge database where the transactions in it are chained together and visible to all those who see it. So it started out as a distributed database. Again, the idea was using open source and shared services. How can we possibly try and create a more secure environment, a more public environment, use the technology? In the beginning, I used to say a lot that the blockchain was a technology in search of a solution, of a problem to solve, right? We had this technology, it's been around for 20 years. Nobody seems to know what to do with it, and we still don't, right? I mean, the reason that everybody seems to be in a panic is that everybody seems to feel like everybody else is doing something with the blockchain except, you, right? There's a press release every day. And if you read the press releases closely, they say very superficial things. I formed a consortium, I joined a consortium. I formed a business unit, I invested. I bought something. But you haven't yet read a press release that said, here's how much I made, here's how much I cleared, here's the giant problem that I solved. So everybody's in the same spot of trying to figure it out and dabbling in it and learning how to best apply it. One of my and I think if we walk away with anything, this is one of the most important pieces. The blockchain is a how, it's not a what. So that's why I asked the question about whether or not the blockchain should be regulated. It's a how. We don't regulate our mainframes. We don't regulate Java. It's a how. It's a technology on which you do what. So what is it that you're trying to do? Is it a smart contract? Is it a proof of existence? Is it a cross-border transaction? That's the what. And those get regulated. The what's get regulated. What you're trying to do. How is standards, interoperability. There's a new group formed, called, not a new group, but WC3 has formed a new work group for digital ledger standards so that all financial institutions and folks in the practice can figure out what, those standards should look like. So here's the chaining reference that I made. Again, it starts a long time ago where somebody said, hey, using this open source, which is now, right, the community building, if everybody's comfortable with open source, it's community building in this open environment is what everybody's looking to do. And the blockchain has now allowed that to be able to be much more secure. Overall, what you're really looking at is a chain of transactions that are literally a physical chain, except they're inside this huge network. And what folks do, if you've all heard the nodes, it happens to be that the largest public, and there's public versus private blockchains as well, right? Ripple is more of a closed private, whereas the Bitcoin network is the largest in the world. And it's the single largest use case from a scale perspective that still exists. It's the realest and the largest, from a scale. Because it is the first one that was actually in place. As you heard in someone's presentation, it's lost some of its power. It's a little bit slower and slower, so now they're trying to create a duplicate blockchain over here, which they call forking, which allows them to take it and maybe go take the blockchain in a different direction and scale it. Because the other thing we don't have is scale. So as many transactions as there is that flow on the Bitcoin blockchain, and I'm talking about the Bitcoin only because it is the largest blockchain, they didn't build it for scale back when it actually first came out. So no, those kinds of issues are being addressed as well.
The underlying factor that doesn't allow it to scale right now is the cryptography that goes behind it. The cryptography is pretty extensive. It takes a lot of MIPS, it takes a lot of processing power to actually execute. And because of that, you're not able to scale it right now. So there are different ways that people are looking at it. They're looking at it to split. So you've got 3 elements in a payment. You've got the authorization, you've got the clearing, and the settlement. So they're looking at how can we split it. Maybe do authorization and clearing on a different technology, just do the settlement on this technology. So there are different approaches that are being applied to it at this stage.
And this is when we talk about the distributed consensus. So now we're getting into the electronics where the beauty of being able to figure out how to use it in certain kinds of transactions, or where you're allowed to now view, because it's transparent and you can see it. And so the way it is, and I don't even want to get into the miners, it's more the ledger itself, and it isn't all financial. I mean, I know we talk about payments a lot, and there's a lot to talk about in payments, but some folks will say the payment piece might actually be one of the later pieces because because of the design. We are financial institutions in general, and there's a ton of regulatory, and there's a ton of risk averseness, and trying to figure it out. But when you look above, that payment is the end of a transaction. It's not the beginning, it's the end. So think of all of the steps that took place in front of it, whether you're talking about trade, supply chain. There's a group in London, England, those guys are all crazy over there about blockchain. And they're looking to see how they can put mortgages into it, right? So when you think of the pain and time and paperwork for a mortgage in any country, it doesn't matter where, and how many times it's handed off, notarized, filed, how many copies of it exist, in how many different filing cabinets, right? Think your car title, think patents. So they all kind of fall in this category of smart contracts. The insurance industry is huge looking into how they can handle some of the paperwork. The stock exchange, bonds, and are all heavily looking at it. So don't always think about it just as the payment and how we're going to move it and somebody's going to steal it. Think of all the file cabinets that have individual copies of all of this paperwork that could now be condensed into one chain that is completely transparent to all the parties, settled immediately. Think about doing a mortgage in a week instead of 60 days or 90 days, right? A car title. One of the more creative uses, and I always want to get into current state versus future. We all have a tendency to say, what am I doing today? Along comes blockchain, it's going to solve all my problems. I just need to take what I'm doing that's not working and I need to move it onto the blockchain. You really need to figure out what the problem is you're trying to solve before you figure out the blockchain can help you, right? So just using the blockchain, it's a technology. We have to understand it's not new. It's not going to solve world hunger. Food will, but it won't. It's what am I trying to solve? Do I want to do it tomorrow the way I'm doing it today? Or do I want to change it? And can the blockchain technology actually fit in under there and help me?
And use case that we're going to talk about is around trade and supply chain. So you'll see how it becomes relevant for financial institutions to look at it.
Right, and especially if you are a financial institution, we all know how painful the trade process is, right? And when you combine other creative pieces with it, and Iqbal will talk about it, but you can put escrow. So you have, what we call micropayments or incremental or escrow, or somebody has another name for it. It's a fancy name. Think escrow. But if you think of the trade transaction from beginning to end, if you can, one, take the bill of lading, the invoice, so that whatever kicks off the transaction initially, that's in the blockchain, agreed to by all parties. Then it goes on the ship, and then it goes across the ocean, and then it lands, and then there's a guy that inspects it, and then it gets on a train, and then it gets on a truck, and then, right? All of this has got tons of paperwork and signatures. So think of all of those getting locked down, and that each time one of these transactions is agreed to, money moves. Even if it's in an escrow, like the guy doesn't get his money till the end, until everybody agrees everything's fine, and the guy at the end opens it up and says, yeah, this is what I got. If you got the notice that your funds have been transferred in escrow, your incremental piece, everybody can rest, right? So now you can take this really long, laborious, and you still need a lot of trading partners to play, which is why it's not as easy as it sounds. Everybody has to play. But now you can take a very painful, long transaction, and everybody along the way, and they can go back to their, like, I shipped it off, he accepted it, I got my money, I'm good, right? So the possibilities, but we always have a tendency to think about what I'm doing today and moving it on to it existing. Anybody remember the days of EDI 20 years ago? And, we're going to take everything we were doing, electronify it. Well, think about what you're doing, and do you actually want to do it? Secondly, and then it's really about innovation as well. What are you not doing with it that you didn't think about? So we'll talk in depth about the trade transaction and how that can work, but one of the examples we use in Europe a lot, there's a musician named Imogen Heap. And anybody in the entertainment industry, people are always stealing music, right? They're stealing pieces of music and trying to use it in mixes and other stuff. So she, brilliantly, 6 or 8 months ago, decided to put her music on the blockchain in increments, in 30-second increments. So now she's selling and making money, this much of the Bitcoin, but she's selling it freely. People can now take it and use it legitimately and not get sued. And she's turned the use of the blockchain into something that none of us would have ever thought about, even a year ago, let alone 5 or 6 years ago. So as we look to use the blockchain that already exists in many places, in open source and other, for current activities, the other piece would be to see what don't we even know yet that we could possibly use it for. The innovation side, I think, is very key.
Yeah, that is actually, if you look at it, think about Airbnb and Uber. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, nobody would have ever thought about that. But now it's become quite ubiquitous, and people are going and putting tons and tons of money behind all of the taxi services out there, not just Uber.
So here's one of the other things that confuses people a lot. Sometimes you'll hear it called the trustless network. And it sounds oxymoronic, especially in financial institutions, right? Because we want our vault with our guns, and we want the network where everybody's been checked out in. We want that kind of physical security, But in reality, and this is where you have to get announced technical, is the way it works is the nodes that are set up, okay, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of nodes all over the world. Just think of the internet, right? It's like, where are the nodes? Who's running them? Just like the internet, right? Everybody's using the internet, but nobody knows who's doing what necessarily in there. So think of it that way. Because of the way the transactions flow through the network, and you can have permissioned or permissionless. So permissioned means, hi, can I join your network? Yes, you can join my network. So you've been vetted in some way and you're trusted in a different way. Then there's the trustless, right? The trustless and or Bitcoin and or open permissionless network works on the power of the people, of the nodes. So any transaction, no matter what it is, that goes into that network has to be blessed by 10 nodes. And when I say blessed, the guy that gets there the quickest validates that it's legitimate, and you get 10 yeses, the transaction goes through. The fight is to be one of those 10, because the first 10 are the only ones that get paid. So that's why it's so fast. That's how they're validating the transaction. So the trust comes from sheer volume. 10 separate nodes said this transaction is good, therefore the transaction can go through. So that's why it's called trustless, because you don't need trust. I don't need to know who you are to make the transaction work. I need to trust the network, so that's why it's called trustless. You're on blind faith that it's going through because of all of these checks and balances that happen with the volume, the scale.
And that's a very interesting point, because a lot of central banks are getting involved in this early because they want to understand and they want to control or regulate to some extent. How is it actually going to grow, and how they're going to keep control of their currencies, and what will be the impact of that.
And it is increasing. We have a couple examples in here of folks' press releases that have said, what they're doing, or they're launching a coin. But the most interesting piece throughout the world is when you get into the currency piece again, everybody gets concerned because it's not a fiat currency, right? And in some countries it has become legal tender, it's become fiat currency, Switzerland and France being one of the two more leading countries that has actually made it a tender. If anybody remembers what happened in Greece, the way that everybody got their money out of the bank before the government took it was they got themselves bitcoins so that they were out of the banking system. So the currency does have clever ways to look at it, but the regulators are increasingly involved. At that first Bitcoin meeting, every central bank was there. The U.S. Central Bank, the South American Central Bank, every central bank was there, and they just kept asking these Bitcoin guys, who, by the way, are all like 12, okay? And they're really smart, and they don't know the banking system, so they're not bogged down in all of our stuff. Every time they'd ask them a question, they very smugly answer with, you don't have to worry about that. The system never goes down. You don't have to worry about that. It never gets hacked. And, you know, I even said to them at the end of the day, if the central bank, if 7 central banks asked you the same question 45 times, you haven't answered it, right? You're not thinking in terms of how that they can come in and shut you down, and they can affect what you do. That's, again, the piece that's evolved. Almost all of the regulators are involved in some degree talking about either the currency, mostly the network, right? How can we use it? Can the Fed use it? You know, how can I, as a central bank, deploy technology that would allow me to serve my customers better? So when you strip away the negativity, and you strip away the currency and all of that volatility, you now have a technology that does seem to be more real time. Again, you can hear 2 seconds, you can hear 20 minutes in some of these transactions. It depends on the size of the network. Is it a private network or a public one? Because, again, Bitcoin being public, permissionless, it comes into a scale issue. And then you get into smaller ones that focus on very specific activities, right? Some of these platforms are trade only. Some are FX only. Some are smart contract only. So each of these, there's a plethora of providers that, you know, are in the space from front to back, in the wallet space, in the technology space. And so you really just have to focus on what it is that you're trying to do and how this technology can actually play in. But don't think that the regulators are not involved, because they are. They are actually passionately involved, and the United States Fed has said very specifically, as obviously the central banks in Europe, this is legitimate, it has a place, we just need to work it out. And the beauty of having the regulators at the table before, as Bitcoin learned, was they need to understand it. I mean, we all know regulation only happens after something bad happens. A regulation doesn't occur before. It happens after something bad happens, right? So if you have them at the table thinking of the what-ifs, it absolutely can make the use of it, you know, much more. But again, I really want to emphasize, the blockchain itself doesn't need to be regulated. It's a technology, just like your mainframe, just like ISO 20022, just like XML. It's a technology, it's a format. What you're doing on it is where you want to focus. Are you doing the right thing? Are you moving the money the right way, the contract the right way? Then you want to focus on standards and interoperability, because these blockchains aren't all alike. So you want all of your blockchains, you know, your whole blockchain to be able to talk to each other.
So that's very interesting. We just completed a POC with 2 banks, a central bank, and obviously us. The 2 banks, and these are multinational banks, and the 2 banks, they kept looking at the central bank. They said that, you know, if you tell us we have to do this, it'll make it easier for us to get this thing done. Otherwise, we have to build a business case, we have to go and justify the technology, ensure, you know, give everybody satisfaction that yes, it's matured and everything. But if you regulator tell us that we have to do this, you know, we don't have any choice. We have to just go out and execute. So that's a way that the banks are looking at this as well.
I mean, who here doesn't love a sunset letter, right? Who doesn't love a sunset letter? Just give me a letter telling me you're going to retire the system next year so I can go upstairs and get my upgrade, right? That's one of the best ways for you to be able to do it. So when you can get into situations where you work with the central bank or other banks, and again, it doesn't always have to be banks, it can be trading partners, right?
Yeah.
You really can get stuff done a lot faster in the teamwork environment with the feds than trying to write the business case, and we'll talk about the business case a little bit.
Okay.
Again, these are just examples for you of recent, there's 300, I just picked some of the larger ones where, so how big is it, right? Everybody says you can go one more. This is just a list of ones that are probably familiar to you. I think I have the Tower of Babylon in there. that has, more. But again, is it real? Yes. When will it grow? Probably 5 to 7 years. It's not next year at all. There might be pockets, there might be specific transaction sets that evolve faster than others based upon, but we do have legacy networks, not just banks, but legacy networks in its totality. Some of the examples you hear the most, Ripple will be joining us for the panel afterwards. They're an example of a permission network that's been around for a little bit now. Stellar many of these are partners for all of us, for both of us. I think I have personally signed 22 different partners in the blockchain space, aside from my 10,000 person open source practice, because that's how many are dabbling, right? There's a startup every day focusing on different things, and you really want to take advantage of that. You'll settle down on one, but you really want to be able to figure out who's doing what, who's funding them, who focuses on smart contracts versus money versus cross-border. NASDAQ, as you may have heard, NASDAQ has got its own thing going to work all of the stocks and the bonds and the exchanges. So that's a really heavy place where they've taken a lot of interest in investment and looked at it. But again, don't always think about it just in terms of payments or finance. Think of it in terms of all the transactions that you want to be able to look at using the technology.
Okay, so let's
He's going to talk very specifically about...
so this is a use case that we've taken up just to have a conversation around that. By the way, the mortgage one is being, right now, there's a Scandinavian country that is actually taking and putting all of their real estate onto the blockchain. And so they're testing that out. So this is, if you look at trade, right, what is trade? You've got siloed processes across trade. A lot of paper documentation, whether you talk about a bank, or you talk about a shipping company, or you talk about a port. They're all a lot of documentation that's there. They're all physical contracts, so you've got to have a physical bill of lading for you to actually take possession of your goods. There has to be a bill of exchange, and that has to be a physical bill of exchange. That's the only thing that a judge will pass judgment on. And then there are physical inspections that have to be done. Is the right good coming in? Is other goods that have been packaged up with that good that's coming in? So there's a customs check. There is the importer wants to make sure that the exporter is sending the right thing. So all of those things. And right now, they're point-to-point connections. So you have the importing bank. They'll send it to the exporter, and it'll send it to the exporting bank. You've got the shipping company that's a direct, a single point connection to the exporter, and then the banks and things. So there's all of these cross connections that have to happen today. Actually, I'll come back to this. So if you look at trade overall, you've got three major players. You've got banks, you've got ports, and you've got logistic companies. These are three major players in a trade transaction. And then you've got smaller players. You've got all of the regulators that play a role. You've got the bank regulators, and then you've got the port regulators, you've got custom agencies, you've got tax companies, regulators there. Then you've got certifiers. Certifiers are entities that will come and check the goods once it's been put onto a ship. So you've asked for tractors. They've got to have 20-foot tires, green in color. The certifier will come in, they'll check, yes, there are 20 tractors, they're green in color, and they've got 20-foot tires on them. And then they'll send a report out. And because banks are only interested in the documents, as long as the bank sees that, the exporting bank sees that, all of the documents are complete, they'll give the money to the exporter. When the importing bank sees that, they see all of the documents complete, they'll give the money to the exporting bank. So that's all their concern is. That's what the certifier is. Insurance companies play a role in the shipment. They keep track of what's being done. So what is it that we're seeing here? So far, all of the POCs that have happened, there have been a number of POCs that are happening across the globe in the trade space. And they're all happening in the silos. So the banks are looking at it within their silo, and they're saying, okay, listen, how much of our process can we get off and put onto the blockchain? And I'll come back to, what is it that the process is about. But they can't control the documents that come in from the port, for instance, or the document that comes in from the shipping company, the bill of lading, or the airway bill. They're all physical documents. So they have to take that physical document, and then they have to map it onto their own systems. So there's key entries going on. Then there are certifiers that are given by the agriculture. So if you import flour, for instance, it has to have a number of different certifications around it. That different types of pesticides were not used on it. What sort of soil was used? What sort of, that there aren't any bugs or anything that's coming onto the flowers. So all of those certifications have to be provided, and they have to be provided by the exporting country. These are government agencies. Now, these government agencies, the only way that you actually know whether this is authentic or not is a rubber stamp. And sometimes that rubber stamp hasn't got all the ink on it, so it's not clear. Sometimes it's slightly, the hand got twisted, so there has to be someone physically looking at it. And most banks that I know of have actually tried some sort of automation, some sort of digitization around it, and they haven't been able to get out through that because that stamp cannot be replicated. What we're doing here now is we're working with a number of ports and logistic companies and banks, and we're actually taking a smart contract and we're running it from a retailer. So the importer and the exporter are negotiating the contract, the purchase order. That purchase order comes onto that smart contract. That same smart contract goes to the bank. The bank puts on all of the rules and regulations that have to drive to issue the LC, and all of that is done on the smart contract. It's the same document, and that document then goes into from the importing bank to the exporting bank, then to the shipper, and from there, whatever needs to be provided to the regulators, it's provided to the regulators, and it's used by the logistic companies, by the ports, by the bank, the same document. Now this is possible today because of blockchain, because if you look at the contract, the smart contract technology, it's been around for at least a decade, if not more. But, if 5 of us were part of a contract, once we agreed on the contract, 2 of us could go ahead and agree on doing something different from the contract. The rest of the people would not find out about it until the goods were actually delivered. Now, with blockchain, since every time the status changes, it is actually hashed and recorded on the chain code, and it cannot be changed, everybody who's involved in that particular transaction actually knows and agrees on that transaction, and then it moves forward. So now that's what makes the blockchain enable this trade across all of the different industries, and that's the exciting thing about it. It's not the fact that you can put it onto one smart contract, but that you can break the silos across industries. Once you've broken the silos across industries, that is going to open up the different trade channels that you've got. There's about 2/3 of the trade that happens today happens off the books or letter of credits. Why? Because it's called bulk trade. It happens because someone has found out that magnesium is being sold at a discount somewhere. They will go and grab as much as that can and ship it out to wherever it is used. There isn't enough time to go out and get a letter of credit in place. But if you can move this, which is now, it takes between 18 and 43 days around a letter of credit, if you can move that to within a day, you suddenly opened up a totally different industry for yourself.
And then, so we're going to move into the panel, I know, real quick, but we're out of time.
Oh.
So we can talk about it more later. I'm getting the signal.
Okay. I just want 1 minute on this, okay, because this is relevant. Now, the only thing that I'm going to talk about here is the chain code that you see on the right side. The chain code is where you can actually put processes in place. So letter of credit process, for instance, both the banks will be doing the same process when they check the documents. You can put that process onto the chain code, and it's only done once. That in itself reduces so much time, effort, and creates an opportunity. Okay, back to you.
So keep going. Okay, so keep on. So this is the Tower of Babel that I talked about before. So this is just a snapshot of, but this is like 6 months ago, so it's probably completely different, but look at the players in the space and where they sit, right? Who knows if half of them are still around and who's coming up next. So in summary, I had someone at the booth this morning, if you can flip to the next one. I had someone at the booth this morning who, if you'll out yourself, I would love it, but I'll use your words, said that her boss was panicked over this thing coming along that's going to wipe out financial services as we know it. It's going to take over banks and bank accounts. It's going to completely eradicate them. So calm down. It's just not true. It's a technology that's really cool that we can figure out how to use to improve our processes and do stuff we haven't even thought about yet. Everybody's in the same spot. Play. Find somebody to help you. And we can talk about it more in the panel, but find somebody to help you. Because you can't grade your own work. You can't write a white paper and tell your management about the internet in 1995 without somebody saying he's right. He's totally right, or he's totally wrong, right? So everybody's at that play and sandbox stage. It's really important to just understand that's where everybody's at. If you can get to a POC, that's a success. So I think our panelists are coming up now.
And the people who get to the stage first, get their products in play, they'll have an edge on others.
Okay.
Right, cool, ladies and gentlemen. Keep calm and use blockchain. We're going to find out a little more about it now as we move into our panel discussion. I'm going to ask 3 panelists to come to the stage and give them 5 minutes each to just give their view, first and foremost, on where they see blockchain and their involvement within it. Perhaps it's appropriate that first and foremost, I call Adrian Hope Bailey to the stage. He's from a company already mentioned in Marianne's presentation, the company called Ripple. Adrian has worked as a technology researcher, software engineer, product developer, and solutions architect, and today represents Ripple as their standards officer, co-chairing a working group at the World Wide Web Consortium to develop new payment standards for the web and pioneering a neutral and open payments protocol called Interledger. All sounds very complicated. I'm just going to stay calm and listen to what he says. Could you welcome Adrian to the stage, first and foremost, please?
Thanks very much. I don't need 5 minutes. I'll try and keep it short. I think you'd much prefer to ask some questions. So I work for Ripple. As was mentioned, Ripple is one of many blockchains, and I guess the position statement from Ripple is we believe there will be many blockchains. Certainly that's my position. There will be a number of blockchains, all with a specific use case, and I think that's what came out of the session preceding, which is very important. That this idea that there will be a global network, which is a single blockchain that everybody will connect to and will replace everything that's come before it is, we believe, just simply not a scalable idea. So where we see blockchain being really valuable is in some of the use cases that have been discussed. So places where you require transparency, an audit trail, clarity around history, those kind of use cases. So identity, trade finance, delivery versus payment, and so on. In the payment space, I think the use cases are very specific. We're certainly at Ripple focused on cross-border, and that comes from three or so years of working with banks and understanding what exactly they are trying to solve with blockchain technology. And the use case around cross-border is definitely the most compelling, where a blockchain that has a native token of value or currency actually offers the ability to pool liquidity and have highly liquid trade between banks. The use case domestically is very difficult to justify, actually. I think a lot of people got very excited, myself included, around how you could use blockchains for domestic clearing. But really, the overhead of trying to run a distributed system like that doesn't actually make a lot of sense when you think there are existing distributed database technologies out there today which could probably achieve exactly the same thing. So I think I'll echo what my colleagues have said before. Blockchain is very exciting technology. It's mostly, its biggest impact, I think, is actually just in changing for us as the payment industry, how we think about architecting a payment system. So Bitcoin came along, it sort of rattled a few bushes, and then suddenly in 2013, it really got people very excited. I think one of my favorite cartoons is that Dilbert cartoon of the pointy-haired boss who just insists he has something to do with blockchain. And I think that's, I think we've got to be very careful not to slip into that trap. Payment systems historically have been very closed systems. There was a dependency on an architecture of a closed network, and I think payments networks are the last closed networks left. The internet's been around for 20 plus years. We do things like sending email, transferring files over an entirely open network, and payments is really the last vertical that needs to change. And I think the greatest value that blockchain has given us is teaching us that's actually possible, and hopefully that's what we'll get out of it.
Our next presenter, ladies and gentlemen, Ricardo Carrera, who's worked for tons of startups across his career, as well as large organizations like Avanade, Microsoft, Accenture. He's worked on large technological developments and transformation projects across the US, the UK, and Australia, mainly in the dot-com boom. He co-leads tech innovation at the Combank of Australia, experimenting on transformative and disruptive technology, and he's here representing Time today. Please step forward, Ricardo. Let's give Ricardo a round of applause, please.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today, and I'm honored to be up on a panel with these lovely folks. So I'm going to do this quick for a couple of reasons. Number one, I was told I had 5 minutes, but I think I now only have 3. And number two, I think I've had about 8 coffees today. So real quick. So my dad still reminds me today of the pain that I caused him whilst I was growing up. My curiosity for technology led me to kind of dismantle most of the electronic gadgets at home. And of course, it was always such a relief when I'd put them all back together again and there were no parts left on the table. Of course, that never happened. So hence his displeasure. So that was at the beginning of kind of a lifelong journey in technology that started in disrupting technology, and it's kind of ended up in exploring disruptive technologies. So as Michael mentioned, I kind of have 2 roles today. I have 2 jobs. My first job is working at the Commonwealth Bank. I co-lead technology innovation for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And in that role, my team and I have a portfolio of technologies that are both disruptive and transformative, from big data, which we heard today was actually small data aggregated, to social technologies, the Internet of Things that we heard about today, artificial intelligence, smart machines, cyber, the blockchain, of course, and quantum computing, one of the moonshots that we're looking at. And anecdotally, the New South Wales University in Sydney has one of the most exciting labs in quantum, building qubits in silicon. Based on the fact that our transistors today are based in silicon, it's one of the most commercially viable opportunities. Very exciting. For those security folks in the room that aren't looking at the quantum resistance of your networks, I'd strongly urge you to start looking at that. My other job is actually I'm seconded to the R3 Consortium and have been for the last 4 months as the head of Asia Pacific. I'm building a team out in the region and working with some of the largest banks who are scratching their heads and trying to figure out what the hell this thing's going to do to their businesses. We have kind of 2 main streams of research. There's the technical stream, where we're looking at things like identity, which is really exciting. Interoperability, so along with Ripple and the Interledger protocol, R3 has its own interoperability, as does Hyperledger and so on, so interoperability is key. And of course, some of the business processes that we heard today, trade finance, cash on ledger for central banks. There's other really interesting business processes like procurement that don't attract legislation and regulation, which is kind of interesting. For me, kind of the most exciting part of the blockchain is really the confluence of several technologies that come together. And it's not really about the things or making the things that we do today better, but really looking at making better things. So I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm excited for our discussion. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, the head of mobile and digital payment innovation at Standard Bank locally here in South Africa, Ngoni Simelane, is here to join us as well. Please give him a round of applause as Ngoni steps up to the stage.
Good afternoon. I joined Standard Bank, quite a number of years in the chaotic days of the internet. At that time, the World Wide Web was just emerging, and we're trying to understand how we can exploit it and what we can do with it. Email was starting to leak out of closed networks and starting to enable us to send messages across the world faster than envelopes and memos and so on and so forth. We were starting to use transfer files, large volumes of files, securely through this thing called the internet. And today we find ourselves at a similar time in the case of blockchain. It's a chaotic world. Blockchain is the equivalent of what the internet was for us in those heady days, where we're just starting to look at and starting to understand the different use cases. In those days it was email, it was the World Wide Web, it was transferring of files. Today it's about identity, it's about payments, it's about existence, and so on, and contracts. These are all interesting use cases, and it's only through experimentation that we can actually understand their applicability. Does it work, does it not? At Standard Bank, we've got a number of experiments that we are running in these various different use cases. And it's a pleasure to join this panel to share some of the things that we are looking at and some of the applications as we see them going forward. We're not a technology company by any means. We're a user, like many of you here. And we are hoping to understand how to use the technology, and we're hoping we don't have to be creating the technology in order to be using it. So hopefully it's going to mature, it's going to stabilize, and we will be the users of the technologies. Certainly we hope we don't end up as some of the encyclopedia companies ended up, who didn't understand how the implications of the technology when it arrived, or the internet technology when it arrived, and wiped them out.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I've got some questions for our panel, ladies and gentlemen. If you have got questions of your own, please raise your hand. Our microphone runners will bring you the mic as well, so that you can have your own blockchain questions and queried answers coming out. Marianne, let me start with you first and foremost. Which industry or vertical do you think has benefited the most from blockchain, and why?
So if we go with consumer first, because that's how it started, I would say P2P. From a corporate perspective, from a business perspective, I would say the biggest opportunities the most interest seem to be insurance. And I would throw some of the capital markets in there because that gets blended together. Would probably be one of my higher ones, and then I always fall back to the trade conversation because of all the pain that you heard Iqbal and I talk about before. And then the third one where I spend most of my time on top of those two is cross-border. Everybody, I mean, if you're a B2B, it's 2016 and we still can't move money cross-border, business to business very easily. I mean, it's really kind of amazing, right? In many countries, you can't access your current or DDA account on a Sunday. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, the consumer world thinks everything's real time, right? Because they got the little thumbs up on their mobile, but we all know behind the scenes it's 3 to 7 days that some of this is still going on. So that's kind of where I'd start.
If I turn to Iqbal next to you then, because I know that you're chomping at the bit, sir, dying to get something out.
No, so I was actually just going to add to what Marianne said, and it's not just a matter of getting the transactions across. It's within the same bank, if you look at it, I'd say 90% of the banks are doing individual transactions. They might have 200 transactions of pound to dollar, but they're individual transactions that are happening during the course of the day. And what you can actually build into all of this, and again, it's what Andrea said was that it's using the ability for Bitcoin for blockchains is the ability to use technology better. And so you can actually net out and have cutoff times and actually net and just do the transaction that's netted rather than, and have all of the information related to that sent across.
I'm intrigued by that. Let me turn to Adrian from Ripple, if I may then. And I hope this is a fair question for you. Do you believe that somebody should be providing the oversight for blockchain? And who should that somebody be?
So, blockchain is a technology. I think one of the mistakes that we often make is talk about the blockchain as if it's this thing out there. I think so a lot of people will talk about the Bitcoin blockchain as the blockchain. I think regulation of the Bitcoin blockchain is, jurisdiction independent. However you want to do it, go for it. I think it's a mistake of regulators to be dumb on the matter. I think regulators should not leave innovators in a dilemma of not knowing which way the regulator is going to go. But I think it's more about setting regulations that provide a framework for people to work within. So making decisions about if you employ this technology, this is how we're going to regulate it, and start to set some sort of structure that people can build upon, because there are different blockchains that work differently as well. So it's a challenge, but I think the answer has to be sort of a frameworked approach as opposed to something very specific.
Marianne, do you want to comment on
I
that?
really just want to echo that, right? I mean, we're saying the same thing, and we think it's one of the most important messages to walk out with is there's no such thing as the blockchain, by the way. It's a blockchain. Everybody can have a blockchain. You can have a blockchain. I mean, we've had people download open source over the weekend, write a ledger. Okay, what are you going to do with it? Where is it going to go? And what are you doing? So it's a how. It's not a what.
Yeah.
The Bitcoin blockchain is a what, because it's both, right? But a blockchain is a how, and you don't regulate hows. You regulate what you do on the hows.
There's been a lot of confusion over that, though, because of the close association, particularly with Bitcoin and blockchain technology. More recently, last week or so on social media, a great article went viral talking about the fact that Bitcoin and blockchain need to be seen as two distinctly separate things. Is that just the dawn of realization to get back to the basics, or the get-go that you're talking about now?
I think that the realization that any currency, because we at banks in here that probably created a currency, the city, and everybody likes to create a little coin, right? A city coin, a standard bank coin, so you can do that, but it's the underlying technology. So people I think, to your point, in what I was trying to portray in the 3 years, is that we've evolved. We're less fearful of the word Bitcoin, period. We've evolved. Bitcoin itself has become more engaged in the entire community. But we've realized that this underpinning of technology that Hashimoto decided to build Bitcoin on has been around, and it's just now being really understood and exploited the way that it can be.
So as it becomes mainstream, Ricardo, perhaps I can call you in then. Which industries do you believe, in your case, would benefit most and least from blockchain?
Well, I suppose financial services industry, is that better? Financial services industry is pretty obvious. That's where Bitcoin was kind of invented to kind of sort out some of the issues, especially when GFC was born. When GFC came about. Some of the other industries that we're seeing, and I think Marianne alluded to this, is insurance. Probably a category within financial services is getting a resurgence in investment. So insurtech and insurance is really exciting. The others that we're seeing at the Combank is agriculture. So agtech is huge at the moment, and kind of the nexus of the Internet of Things with the blockchain is offering some really exciting opportunities in ag. Some of the others that aren't so obvious, academia is really interesting. So the proof of your academic record. Just recently in Australia, the Telstra CTO was fired for falsifying some of his resumes. So how do we protect against that? Interestingly, there are a lot of folks that I'm familiar with working on disrupting, kind of the disruptor, right? So disrupting LinkedIn, because some of you would have seen that you are getting raided by LinkedIn by people that don't really know you, right? So it's a bit of an interesting this space. So academia is really great. Healthcare is another really beautiful space, right? So the ability to control your own health record, a little bit of an issue at the moment with doctors that provide a diagnosis on you and then claim that data, but the data is on you. So, the ability to give you control of your health record. The ones that would benefit least was the second part of your question. Gosh.
Donald Trump.
Yes, okay, that guy.
His tax records.
Okay, that is...
They'd be out.
Donald Trump. Is he in industry? I don't know, but yeah, that guy.
Donald Trump is certainly in industry.
He does like to think so, doesn't he? Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know. I'll turn to the other guys on the panel. What industry would benefit least? I mean, even the government would benefit, I think, from the blockchain.
Actually, there are a number of governments that are actually pursuing this. They're actually driving it because it's going to bring their cost of operations, reduce their cost of operations, and eliminate paper currencies. That's their target.
But let's bring Angoni in here, because you said you hope you don't have to develop the technology. We're a financial institution, standard bank. What are you most looking for out of blockchain technology to improve the lives of basic South Africans?
So we have a number of use cases that we are looking at, and in every single one of those use cases, we are not looking at rolling out our own blockchain, our own distributed ledger. I mean, it doesn't work if you're just playing on your own. So we are looking at what is happening around the world and who's doing what, so that we can participate in those forums and then develop the solutions for our market on top of those ledgers. So the key ones are the ones that we've already mentioned, obviously, is the cross-border payments. That, in this day and age, is still a big bugbear, ironically. The other one is trade. I mean, trade is a massive problem. It's a multifaceted problem because it's got so many people that are involved in it. It's the blockchain, just like the internet, we don't think people should have to interact with this technology directly, right? Their experience and their interaction with this technology is always going to be indirect. In much the same way that people don't interact with the internet directly. They interact with the World Wide Web, with the email. So these are the use cases on top of that. So to the extent of when we talk about the blockchain, yes, I agree, there isn't a single instance of the blockchain, but it's similar to how we talk about the internet, right? When we are really talking about the World Wide Web.
Yes.
And that's a very similar thing that is starting to happen now. People pick a particular use case and they call it the blockchain. But if we get our act right, the experience that our customers and our partners have in the service that we already provide should be significantly enhanced without them having to trip over and stumble over and have to understand this thing called the blockchain.
Interesting answer, thank you. Adrian, chip in if you will.
I have an interesting take on that and your previous question, which I've raised in the past, and it was sort of a moonshot. But you asked about regulating blockchains, but and I thought about it from a payments perspective, obviously given the context. Yes. But what would be interesting is if governments, and we're hearing that this is happening, but especially in a country like South Africa, where we know that we have transparency issues occasionally, if a government came forward and said, well, we're going to put down some legislation, not tied to a specific blockchain, but that says we are going to provide some sort of precedent for the legality of a blockchain as a public notary service, or something along those lines. So just put down the foundations for innovation. Say, here's some law that allows people to go off, innovate together, get together. Maybe the South African banks want to get together and they want to set up a new identity service in South Africa. And they've got the blessing of the South African government that if they build this on a specific blockchain, on blockchain technology, it will have legal standing. So there's more than just sitting back and waiting to see what the innovators can do. There's definitely a need for some sort of proactiveness, not only in the regulatory space, but potentially in government as well.
Let me push you further, though. Do you think that blockchain technology should form the basis of our national payment system?
No.
Tell me why.
I think our national payment system is pretty good, actually. It's world class. I think it could form a piece of that system, but a system doesn't consist of a single platform. We have multiple payment streams all handled in different ways. I think there's an opportunity for blockchain to be a part of that ecosystem. But certainly I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, we need to just put everything on a blockchain. That's a huge mistake.
Gordon, let me come to you, and then Adrian, I'll come to you, sir.
If I may just add on to what
of
you
course.
just said. In South Africa, we've got this project on authenticated collections. It's a massive project, and there are hundreds and hundreds of millions being spent on this initiative. When I was talking to some of my colleagues that are involved in this project, the question I was asking them was, why didn't we choose to do this using a distributed ledger? Because it really is about authenticating collections that are going to be honored or requested and honored at some point in the future. And it's a fairly good example of where we should have had a regulator that said, you're not going to do this in the way in which you have solved these kinds of problems before in the past.
Yes.
You're going to solve it in a way that is more scalable and more economic. And now we've got a very expensive project. Everyone's building their own empire. Everyone's building their own silo. And to break it, all I need to do is change my banking relationship and the whole thing falls apart. And yet, if it had been on a distributed ledger, it doesn't matter that I change my banking relationship. My agreement with my service provider, whether it's my insurance company or my mobile network operator, would be on the ledger for my new bank to see and to honor in the event that a collection request comes in.
But you can see why within that, Ngoni, that Marianne's slide earlier at the end saying, keep calm and just go to blockchain, it's causing the reverse to happen. Because of the things that you're saying, it's instilling mass panic, really, isn't it? Ricardo, do you want to come in there?
I'd agree with Adrian. And similarly, in Australia, we have a massive payments project going on. The NPP, the National Payments Platform, started 4 years ago, and about a year and a half ago, everyone was going, gosh, shouldn't we have used the blockchain rather than SWIFT? And I know that's somewhat controversial to call out, so don't throw tomatoes at me, and if you do, I hope you have a
Yeah, please, no, yeah. Wait for him to get off the stage.
but there are some interesting use cases where perhaps you could couple these technologies. So, for example, escrow. If I wanted to buy someone's second-hand car, the registry for that car is held by the Roads and Traffic Authority, but the National Payments Platform doesn't have any access to that registry. So how do you deal with assets that are off-ledger? So in this particular example, perhaps you could have a ledger technology that allows you to do kind of the asset transfer, the off-ledger asset transfer, and then bring the payment back into the payment system. So I think there are opportunities where, yes, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but certainly you start to look at use cases where there is an opportunity to use DLTs.
Let's try, if we may, and use our audience. We've got some 600 of the top people in the payments industry here right now. Can I ask you for a show of hands for the benefit of our panel? How many of you have been looking into or have started thinking about working properly with some form of blockchain technology? If you have, would you raise your hands? So it's not very many people. Yeah. Does that scare you, Marianne? Thank you for that.
Only in the sense that that probably means that what we have to understand is we're still at the infancy stage of some of this, and we're at the education stage. Because when people are scared, it's because they don't know. Right?
Sure, a disruptive technology by its very nature or description is terrifying.
Right, and so the terrifying piece becomes in the silliness of assuming that you're last, that everybody's doing it but you, giving up, doing something even worse, desperate, not thinking it through. That's the panic for me, because I asked the same question in an audience in another country, and I said, who's scared of the blockchain? And every hand went up, and I was like, I'm scared now, because now I don't know who I'm talking to, right?
Would you like to ask the same question again?
But I mean, it's just, I think that when I say keep calm, it really does mean it is in the press every day. There's somebody doing something every day. There's folks that are playing and thinking strategically and innovatively, and there's a bunch of providers that are looking to do it. But I just go back to the days when we've had this happen before, and it's stop and think, where can I use it? Do I have to use it? Do you have to use it? Is it the problem that will solve whatever problem that you have? Is it the technology that will solve it? So I'd like to just have it be at this, it's a great technology that's been around a long time and is getting increasingly used now. How can it be applied in my shop, and what can it do for me? And so get that activity going. Realize nobody's trying to take over the whole world. There's no one solution that's going to solve every problem. There's no one blockchain that's going to solve every problem.
It's not controlled by Anonymous.
It's not controlled by Anonymous.
But it is being developed by a very fragmented base. And therefore, does that, in its own right, lead to more confusion and chaos? Iqbal, your thoughts on this?
So, I would agree with Adrian that you don't throw the baby with the bathwater. So it's not something that you switch over tomorrow. It's, the earliest that anybody's made it, an assessment of having a really viable, end-to-end process, not just one little piece of the process, is, sometime in 2017. But I would say that what it actually allows you to do, that over time, it will start taking over more and more of your payment platforms.
Yes.
And I would say one of the talks was 2035, what's going to happen? I'd say, by 2035, maybe 70% of your payment platform will be on blockchain.
Where's the best starting point now for people, obviously in that infancy that Marianne has mentioned? Where do you most go to get information that's generic, that works? What would you advise our audience to do?
Well, actually, that's what all of the banks are doing. So standard, we just heard here, they're looking at cross-border payments, they're looking at trade. There are governments that are looking at government processes. There are other governments that are looking at putting their real estate onto the blockchain. There's healthcare companies that are looking at putting the country's healthcare onto the blockchain. So all of these POCs are going on around. It's everybody that feels the pain is trying to put something out there.
Has anybody written Blockchain for Dummies and published it on Kindle? Ricardo, your thoughts?
Yeah. I don't think so.
I don't know, maybe. I don't know. But I think just in answer to the question, I think there's a few streams there. One is education and awareness to kind of remove the fear of what it is, right? So it's not that fearful.
But where does one go for that education and awareness?
Well, there's various forums. I'm not plugging a consortium, but consortiums are a quick way to accelerate. Why? Because it just turns out that every single member of our three was doing exactly the same thing before we all got together and went, I'll tell you what, you 5 blokes do it, and then just tell us what you've learned. So
there's a blockchain of information that exists.
Clever. So, yes. And
I don't charge extra for ideas, by the way.
So you can accelerate learning through the partnerships that you have, right? So rather than go into a cross-border proof of concept yourself, perhaps you could leverage the ecosystem and the folks that have already done those to accelerate your learning. And of course, there's experts that can come in and talk to you. The 12-year-old Ethereum guys are very happy to fly around the world and talk to you about Ethereum. They don't cost that much because they actually live in Airbnbs and don't carry much luggage, so it's great. So, there's various ways of doing it. I think awareness is one. Getting your hands dirty and feeling a bit of the pain, I think, is the other. And call Adrian for Ripple because he's here, so all good.
Awesome.
I'm sorry, I just want to echo that whole, it was the commentary I made towards the end, right? It's find a partner or partners. It can be a consortium, it can be a one-on-one, it can be another bank, it can be, learn together and don't ever grade your own work. No matter what it is, don't grade your own work. Don't sit in your 4 walls and think because you've Googled and written and even done an experiment that it's okay. You need to, the value in this is trying to experiment with what's happening on the other end. And so it's just always better with a group, however large that group is, right? And you'll determine that based upon your company culture and budget and other stuff, but it really is important to have other thinkers in the room to push.
Let's come back to Adrian then as well. Your thoughts on that, sir?
I think, so one of the things I made in my statement was that I believe one of the greatest things that will come out of blockchain is changing the way we think. And I'd like to add to that I think it's also going to change a lot of how we behave. And I'm certainly already seeing it in South Africa in terms of how banks cooperate with one another. So banks are starting by kicking the tires in their innovation labs, but a blockchain's no fun on your own. So they're being forced to get out there and start having conversations with each other. And I don't know where those start, whether it's on the golf course or at the Ethereum meetup. But it's changing not only the way we think about architecture of payment systems, but also how we cooperate with one another. Certainly, with my view as a South African, I think that's very encouraging. And I think that's, if the two big positives we get out of blockchain, if it turns out to be a fad and it's gone in 10 years, if the outcome is South African banks working more collaboratively together on solutions and thinking more proactively about open networks, great.
Cool. And let's ask Ngoni at the end. I mean, as one of the banks playing in this space, sir, where did you go for Education 101 on this?
So our organizations are full of really, really smart people, every single one of our organizations. And we found that we already had people that were tinkering with the technology. So various people in IT, our security people, our ops people, and they were just tinkering. They had servers under the desk, they downloaded the code, it's open source, and that's what they were doing. So what our role really was to do was to pull them together and try to legitimize what they were doing, give them cover and funding, and then connect them with the people all over the world that are doing similar things. So every single one of our organizations full of people tinkering. If we were able to get those people together and start talking about what they're doing, working with each other, then it actually works. As we were saying early on, it doesn't work on your own. But that's where we started. It was also important to do it that way because they understand us and our business. Lots of the brochureware that we see is all well and good on the brochure. But within our organizations, we have realities, and our people are seeing the opportunities for this technology in our organization. They're driving this, they're demanding that we legitimize what they're doing, they're demanding the resource, the funding, the people, so that they can actually realize some of these opportunities in our organization. And by just simply connecting those people with the expertise that they needed, which is outside of our organization, we're seeing those people starting to deliver tangible benefits for the organization. They also understand our fears. So they're also enabling the organization to not just look at the technology from the perspective of how can we do what we do better.
Yes.
They're looking at the technology from the perspective of there are things that the organization doesn't do today that this technology allows the organization to start looking at the possibility of doing.
Awesome. And I would suggest that for all of us on the app, ladies and gentlemen, these panelists on the stage, you should be hooking up and connecting with them right now so you can begin your own tinkering in the blockchain technology space. We have a couple of minutes left for open questions. Do you have thoughts, questions, or observations? No question is that silly. We'll bring you a microphone in the front, sir. We can bring a mic down over into the front over here, please. Just whilst that microphone is coming through, any other one would like to ask any other individual questions? Wow, you're going to be busy at the bar tonight, guys, all of you, I think it's. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Baron Tauter. My question is around the technology side, the processing side of blockchains. You mentioned in your presentation that at some point the fastest node that can do the calculations get paid. And I also understand as the blocks get longer and bigger, you need more and more processing power. So my question is, what are the limitations of implementing blockchain in terms of the processing power that you have, both in the nodes and the organization that wants to implement this process? And at what point will it become unwieldy?
So that question, I think, is quite specific to Bitcoin, actually, because it's Bitcoin that uses mining and has those specific requirements. So there's a number of blockchain technologies out there. So Ripple obviously has a different consensus process which doesn't use mining. Ethereum has a different consensus process. So depending on which technology you pick, the answer is actually going to be different. I guess from my perspective, nothing is infinitely scalable. All right, the internet is not a single network that we all have to connect through a single place then to go out. And in the same way, you don't want we're not going to end up with the whole world on a single blockchain. I don't think that's a possibility. Certainly, that's why we're invested in the Interledger protocol. The whole point is how do we connect existing systems and blockchains together in an interoperable way. If somebody tells you that the only way to have interoperability is we get everyone plugged on the same blockchain, they're selling you snake oil, because it's not a scalable way of solving the problem. It doesn't solve the problem, really.
So we're not expecting a telecom of blockchain at any level, I don't think.
Yeah, so I was just going to give you an example of this. So if you take the trade example, if there are 8 people that are transacting in a particular trade, those 8 people will be involved in that blockchain cycle. And then that will, once that trade is complete, then that sort of just settles and goes into some sort of storage. Then the next trade comes into play. And then it could be some of the same 8 peoples or some others that come into the play. So I mean, that's the way that it's going to continue growing. So I mean, I don't think scalability is going to be an issue. It's volume that is being considered right now as to how many transactions you can do in a second. That is something that is being worked on, but I don't think scalability is going to be an issue.
Just to extend that, I think the definition between a blockchain and a distributed ledger technology is important to understand. And also within the DLT side, some distributed ledger technologies are being designed for financial services industry, where, so for example, if you and I enter in a transaction, then you and I will see that transaction, maybe our regulators and some of the consensus nodes, but not everyone in the room around the globe needs to see that transaction because it's not relevant for them. So that reduces the scalability issue. It's private, we're tokenized, and the transaction is not broadcast like it is in Bitcoin or blockchain, but in fact it's kept private. Right.